Hello everyone and welcome to the week 11 and final lecture for the semester.
So what we're going to do today for our final lecture for the semester is think about sex. Probably should have had that on a little bit earlier and closer together with gender. What I wanted to do today was to think about, when it comes to sex, what's normal in inverted commas, and I'm picking up the work of Gayle Rubin, who was writing back in 1984. So bear that in mind. Lots of things have changed since 1984, and also she was American, so we'll have lots of similarities but also some differences in an Australian context as well. I want to think about panics and scandals around sex and ask some questions about whether they reaffirm, consolidate existing boundaries or redraw boundaries. And I guess there I'm thinking about that concept of moral dialogue, which often means that boundaries get redrawn and society becomes a little bit more open. Sex panics, things like the sexualization of children. We usually say children. Often when we're talking about sexualization, though, we're referring to girls. And what's called raunch culture, which is the promotion of sexualized images of women. And again, I should say not all women, that's going to be of young women in particular. So are those sort of sex panics where people get concerned about increasing sexualized images of young women, are they redrawing or redefining the boundaries of what's considered normal? And is it a cause for concern? Or is it about older generations telling young adults what they should be or what they shouldn't be doing? So that's questions that I want us to be thinking about on the way through. I want to pick up on Gayle Rubin's classic essay, which if you haven't read, I'd encourage you to have a read through of that if you get a chance to do it. It's called Thinking Sex and has a longer title as well. It's a classic text in feminist studies, in queer theory, and it was a classic text in queer theory before queer theory really was a study. Very influential text, in some ways a little bit dated, but because she draws on a lot of historical work, again particularly in terms of Europe and North America, I think that's important to be considering that as well, but also remembering that she is talking about North America, not necessarily Australia. She has these 6 challenges to overcoming conventional thinking about sex and what's normal and what's seen as abnormal and therefore stigmatised and marginalised and often criminalised and seen as a mental illness as well. So the first one was to challenge this notion of sexual essentialism, which most of you now will have some idea about this. If we have a position that something is essential, in this case sex, it's seen as a natural force that precedes, goes before our social life. So we have sex and social life kind of builds up around that and shapes institutions. So sex comes first, institutions and society come afterwards. And heterosexuality in this context is normal and natural, and everything else that deviates from it is unnatural. So that's one position. And she contrasts that, though, with social constructionism, and as I say, most of you will be very familiar with this idea because we use it here in a lot of different ways. What she says is that you've got a lot more room for political manoeuvre if you have this idea of social constructionism. And one of the reasons why I encourage you to read her article, even if it's a bit outdated, is because she does draw on a lot of the cross-cultural practices and historical practices and ideas around sexuality. And as soon as you get a history to sex or anything else, or as soon as you get different practices in different cultures, then you know it's a social construct. There's nothing essential about that. And so for her, for Gayle Rubin, she reckons that sexuality is as much a human product as our diets, methods of transportation, systems of etiquette, our manners, forms of labour, all our different types of entertainment, how we go about producing things. So she says that heterosexuality has been naturalised. It appears to be natural, but in actual fact, it's a construct instead. And she says she's not denying the body in that at all, but she says if you think about when you're hungry, that is a normal biological process. We do need to have food, but the type of all the various types of cuisines there are in the world really has nothing to do with that hunger. That's all about society. So she says sex is rather like that. You can put it in the same sort of vein. And if you can think about social construct, if something's been socially constructed, why she thinks it's politically important, you can do more manoeuvring here, because if something isn't natural, ingrained, we can change it. And that's the point of that particular position. So that's her first challenge to overcoming conventional thinking about sex. Her second one is what she calls sex negativity, and again she's writing in 1984, so things might have changed. But she reckons that Western cultures generally, and this is mostly because of our Christian history, consider sex to be dangerous, destructive, a really negative rather than a positive force. And that, as I said, stems from our relationship to Christianity, and for centuries Christian ideas around sex have been it's something that you should avoid, or it's dangerous in many ways because it will lead to some sort of disease, or it will lead to unwanted pregnancy. So Western ideas around sexuality are tied up with Christian ideas. And what Gail Rubin says, that even if you're not particularly associated with Christianity itself anymore, as many of us in Australia aren't, the ideas associated may still be floating around in the atmosphere. You don't have to go to church to be infiltrated, I guess, by some of those ideas. Kind of a corollary to the idea of sex negativity is what she calls the fallacy of misplaced scale. And she says it flows on from that idea that because we've had this notion of sex being bad, therefore what has happened in the West, and she uses Europe and North America, is that heretical sex, so sex that's not orthodox, that's not permitted, socially has actually been punished. I don't have a history of sex in Australia, so I don't know if it's true for here, but what she has said that, one example of anal penetration by somebody could have resulted in that person being executed in the past. So that's all out of proportion to the act, and it doesn't take into account whether that was coercive or consensual at all. It's about the act. So what she says is that some sexual acts are burdened with an excess of significance. Why would that result in execution, that particular act? Her fourth point is this, what she calls this hierarchical valuation of sex acts, and this is where I think maybe some of these ideas might be outdated, but I'll be happy to hear from you on that. Where she says that marital, she's thinking of a pyramid, even though it's represented as a circle. Marital reproductive heterosexuals are alone at the top of the erotic pyramid, she says. Everything else has less value. Calls this at this top what's privileged, what's okay. She reckons that's a charmed circle, and what's in the charmed circle is everything that's seen as good and natural and normal, blessed in some way, and that's heterosexual, married, monogamous, procreative, so having children from it, non-commercial, in pairs, in a relationship, same generation, so that you have sex with somebody of your own generation of a similar age, in private, no pornography, bodies only, and vanilla. So that's kind of the charmed circle. Outside of that charmed circle, she has what she calls, well, I'll go to the outer limits, what's really bad and what's seen as abnormal and unnatural, even damned. She's got homosexuality. Now that has changed, I think. Unmarried sex, promiscuity, non-procreative, such as sex for pleasure, commercial sex, alone or in groups, casual sex, cross-generational, in public, pornography, with manufactured objects, and sadomasochistic. So I think there has been a bit of shifting. So remember, we're talking about 1984. So she reckons that there was this kind of charmed circle and everything else is seen. And that's what's normal and natural, what's been constructed as normal and natural, and everything else sort of moves down to the outer limits, kind of beyond the pale. So that's her fourth point. Her fifth point is what she calls the domino theory of sexual peril. So this idea that if we don't draw a line, and usually a strict line, between what we see as good and what we see as bad sex, then we're going to end up in chaos. And so we have this binary, this line drawn between what's good and bad. And in her time, she's thinking there of what's natural, normal, healthy, even holy, which is heterosexual marriage, monogamous reproductive sex at home. But what was being contested already in her time was unmarried straight couples having sex, promiscuous heterosexuals, masturbation, which in the 19th century, and this is where the history comes in, that was a big no-no, and where children would be strapped to their beds so that they couldn't touch themselves at all overnight. It was very cruel treatment. Long-term monogamous gay and lesbian couples, lesbians in the bar, and promiscuous gay men in a bar as well. So they were already being contested in America at the time that she was writing, so in the early 1980s. Then what she said was still stigmatised at that particular time were considered beyond the pale, abnormal, unnatural, sick or sinful. So transvestites, transsexuals, fetishists, sadomasochists, people having sex for money, and cross-generational sex as well. Do you think that's shifted since 1984? So going back to Rubin, what she sees is that sexual morality is really a form of injustice in the same way that we would see racism as a form of injustice. So why are we going to discriminate against people based on their sexuality or the various sex acts that they're interested in? That's very similar, she reckons, to discriminating against someone based on the colour of their skin or the particular race that they come from. What she says is that a democratic morality should judge sexual acts not by the act itself, as if that's something wrong with that, but by the way the partners treat each other. So the level of mutual consideration, the presence or absence of coercion, and she would be in favour of an absence of coercion unless that was agreed upon, and the quantity and quality of the pleasures they provide. So she's saying it's about the relationship. That should be the primary consideration, not the particular sex act that people engage in consensually. That was 5 points I've done. Her sixth challenge to this idea about what's normal and what's not is the idea of the lack of a concept of benign sexual variation. So the quote is, the variation is a fundamental property of life, from the simplest biological organisms to the most complex human social formations. Yet sexuality is supposed to conform to a single standard, she says. One of the most tenacious ideas about sex is that there is one best way to do it and that everyone should do it that way. If you're interested in the great outdoors and various other natural creatures, you can't help but notice an immense diversity in the world. So that's her point there. There have been changes, as I said, Rubin was writing back in 1984. There have definitely been some trends. So we have moved away from the idea of straight people being married and having sex as kind of the pinnacle now, because kind of had a decline, not necessarily in the number of marriages because of our population increase. So you have to look at the rate of marriage, and the rate of marriage is what's declined. So that's the purple line. So that's the crude marriage rate, is the number of marriages per 1,000. So it's the rate of marriages, not the actual number of marriages. That's important. So the crude marriage rate, the proportion of people getting married, has actually declined over the years. People living together before marriage, major discussion in the 1970s in Australia, major discussion, part of the sexual liberation movement of that time. So most couples now, so in the 1970s, when this was being discussed here, the official figures were only 16% of people lived together before they got married. That's well over 80% of people live together. So no longer is that, and that I guess does assume that people are having sex when they're living together. So that old assumption that the only way you can have, or the best way to have sex is being married, that's been obliterated in Australia since the 1970s. In terms of whether our weddings are endorsed by a religious ceremony. There's been quite a dramatic decline there as well, from in 1902, when probably 99% of the non-Indigenous population were identified as Christian. In 2017, 78% of marriages were performed by a civil celebrant, so somebody who's authorised to perform that ceremony, but outside of a religious ceremony. So things do change. So ex-nuptial or births that are outside of a marriage have been on the incline as well. There are quite a few. So again, if we're thinking about reproductive sex and having children outside of wedlock, huge no-no from the 1950s, and we ended up with a lot of adoptions out of that, but that's not so much of a no-no anymore in Australia. The median age of parents has changed as well. It's interesting that we didn't used to bother with the age of the father, but the age of the father has increased, as has the age of the mother as well. So women are leaving having children until much later these days. So things don't, so for me all of this goes to that idea of change, and that sex and sexuality is all about a social construct. Things do change over time. Do have an increase in the number of people who say that they live in a same-sex relationship as well. And that the figures before that would have been patchy because it wouldn't have been socially okay. So even if people were, they might not have been okay with identifying with that at all. Again, that kind of suggests to me that our attitudes towards homosexual sex has changed since Gail Rubin was writing, that it's not, certainly not as beyond the pale as it once was. So moving to the idea of panics and scandals. So one way to think of a panic is to think of a whole society being involved, or at least being threatened in some way. So our standards of what's right and wrong really is what's being threatened. And the couple of examples that I'm going to look at today are around sexting and pornification. Scandals usually involve very high profile people who transgress some sort of norms that we have. So we have boundaries in place, we know about them, people transgress it. And we talked about this some weeks ago when we looked at sexual scandals. People might have been transgressing for a long time, but then something will happen and a scandal will be ignited. So examples of that, and again, this is not the ordinary you and me. This has to be a high profile person where it affects their standing in the community. Both panics and scandals, we need to think about them as gendered as well. The different consequences for men and for women and for girls and boys around all of this. And both work to both re-establish what's normative. So when we use the word normative, we're thinking about things being naturalised and seen as normal, but we're also aware that it's constructed too. So it's a normative boundary. So usually that's what's going on here. We're trying to re-establish some boundaries, but the boundaries probably also shift. In the 1970s, lots of discussion about whether you could have sex before you got married or not. That all shifted. In the 1980s, we did have some sex wars, and that included in that would have been the discussion about sex workers as well, whether it's good or bad, and this kind of fits in the same sort of discussion about is pornography good or bad for women. And that did lay lots of the foundations for talking about sexuality today, these discussions. So if pornography, or sex work for that matter, is seen as good for women, then it's seen as empowering for women. It's about women having agency. It's not necessarily about the sex being about power. It's more about sex being about pleasure. So women have more agency. So that's the argument for pornography being good for women. And if where pornography is seen as bad for women, it is those points that were raised just then, that ultimately it's about men's power over women and about women being objectified. So that's kind of two extremes of the argument and a whole lot of stuff in between. Quote from Monique Mulholland, who's an academic at Flinders University. She says that pornographic styles, motifs and aesthetics have, since the 1980s, achieved a mainstream public visibility not previously witnessed, and I can attest to that. Instances range from sexed up music videos, sexualised child stars, Playboy branded products in teen marketing, the mainstream popularity of pole dancing classes, sexting, and ease of access to porn on the internet. So we've gone from those discussions about pornography and whether that's good or bad in quite a simplistic binary way for women to this world of pornification, things that were very foreign to me as a child, but which I witnessed happening as I was certainly raising my own children. Is pornification cause for concern? So one way to think about it is if we think about the relegation of pornography to the private and to the bad, in inverted commas, bad sex, you can see that that idea about pornography as being bad, as being beyond the pale, you can see that idea now being challenged quite significantly. The question is, what's that done to so-called normal sex, if anything? It's certainly led to a new form of sex panic, I guess, what's going on. And the focus there is less about women in the 1980s, but these days the impact is more on children, how that is affecting our children rather than women. So it's centred on what you might call adult-centric fears about saturation of pornography for children today, but without necessarily any dialogue with children. I'm going to come to that because that's what Monique Mulholland did. She actually talked to young people about porn. And I guess she asked the question, lots of people ask the question, and somebody else is going to ask that later on, are these sex panics reflective of adult anxieties than of what is really going on? And I guess the only way we know is by talking to each other and talking to children and young people as well. But certainly one of the ideas that's emerged is a return to ideas of abstinence, so no sex, and very conservative ideas of female and male sexuality, which is often about men being predatory and women being at risk and very passive as well. And we ended up with some laws on sexting. In South Australia, sexting is illegal under the Criminal Law Consolidation Act if it involves the possession, production or dissemination of child exploitation material. If you're under the age of 17, you can be charged if you're caught receiving or sending. And it is a defence, though, to a charge of possessing child exploitation material if you can prove that it's come into your possession unsolicited, and as soon as you've become aware that it's come into your possession, that you take steps to get rid of it. And I heard an alarming story just last week about a young girl being bullied in school and felt the need to send pictures of herself, I think she was only 13, to boys in her classroom. So she's doing something unwittingly that's illegal in the state. Revenge porn is an idea that we're using pictures against somebody else, and it's a threat to distribute what are called invasive images. November 2016 here. Penalty of more if the image is somebody under 17, so there's concern about child pornography. Penalty is not as harsh as the production of images. So if you are sending images of yourself underage, then there's a 10-year jail sentence, maximum sentence with that. But if you're sending images of somebody in an act of revenge porn, then the maximum penalty there is 4 years in jail. Very gendered though. Young boys tend to be looking at porn from the figures that we've seen, and looking at heterosexual porn as well. So which brings me to Monique Mulholland's study, and this was conducted in South Australian schools. Can't imagine how long it took her to get through ethics approval. And so she interviewed young people here a few years ago now. Her work was published in 2013, so it is a few years old. She found that students were comfortable speaking about pornography and really explicit sex, and for her that signalled a shift. So rather than pornography being seen as illicit or taboo or so out there that you can't talk about it, similar sort of thing, there's been a significant shift. You can talk about pornography amongst young people now, so not seen as particularly perverse or shameful. The assumption, though, she said, was the talk was of heterosexual sex. Not homosexual sex, nothing else, just straight sex. She said that porn was completely normalised. So when asked to respond to community concerns that adults might have about porn, what the young people said was almost unilateral. So across the board with the young people, porn is just normal now. Because it's really easy to get to the porn sites and then it's so easy to see all that stuff, so no one really cares anymore, says a year 10 girl. Our age now, like it's really normal. It certainly wasn't normal when I was going to school, which doesn't mean to say it didn't exist, but it wasn't normal. It wasn't normal, and it was shameful in quite different ways to now. So this always raises questions about whether we should be censoring the internet. But young people across the board in Monique's study, they thought about their access to pornography is really about exploring sex, about having the freedom to do so, and that they were doing because they were curious. They wanted to know what was out there, because it's part of growing up, says a boy who's year 8. We need to know about these things, another one says, and because young people are curious. So that's what the young people were reporting to Monique. So she makes a couple of observations, the first one being that porn is humorous, it's entertaining and it's fun. Another observation that she made was the distinction between hot and slutty, which is a gendered term referring only to girls. So one boy, a 15-year-old, said both categories might dress the same, but the behaviour matters. So they're making a distinction between somebody being hot, which is a good thing, and somebody being slutty, which is seen as a bad thing. So, and a girl, age 15 as well, said, just say hypothetically you get two girls next to each other wearing exactly the same thing to a party. It really comes down to how you conduct yourself as to whether you're hot or whether you're slutty. Boys were never mentioned in discussions about what marked out those ideas of slutty and hot. So again, this is about girls. And it's not just about girls, because what's the difference between hot and slutty? That's got more to do with than just gender. So what she concludes, Monique Mulholland concludes from her study, is that there's been both an opening up and a closing down in talking about sex and sexuality. So she says the ways in which girls are asked to walk this line between the hot and the slutty works to continue gendered heteronormative logics whereby femininity and respectability, that's the other bit, are intimately and dangerously connected. So there are old ideas, been going on since forever, for a new time. And in my way of thinking, the idea of slut has to do not just with respectability, but it also has to do with class and race as well. And she goes on to say that young people's engagement with porn is a form of heteronormative border work. The power of the heteronorm continues to regulate what is allowed in regard to rethinking heterosexual practice and expression. The ways in which the young people normalise porn both opens up and clamps down on transgressive possibilities. So they don't talk about non-heterosexual porn. They distance themselves from that. Okay, so I want to move now to the States as well with Michael Kimmel, who's a sociologist over there, has done work for years and years around sexuality and gender and has been very much a pro-feminist, except that I have heard some horrible stories about him being accused of assault, sexual assault amongst graduate students. I haven't seen anything as to whether that's gone to court or not, but suddenly he's gone from being a kind of pro-feminist hero to, whoa, a bit questionable. Anyway, the study was done in 2009, so the work to get to that publication was a few years before. He interviewed uni students and he was interested in this idea of hookup culture. And he reckons that dating is kind of gone in America, but you hook up instead. And that includes a range of practices. It might just mean kissing, but it might also include sex. He found that half the students had 3 to 5 hookups, a quarter never hooked up, and a quarter had 8+ hookups in their university time together. When women during the first semester of their first year, men were more consistent in engaging that over the 4 years of university. When it came to orgasms after a one-night stand, 2/3 of men did, only 1/3 of women. When they were asked whether their partner orgasmed, the women were accurate in saying yes or no, but the men overestimated by 3 times. The women said that they faked it, and they did this for a couple of reasons. One, because they felt bad for him, or they were getting bored, and so they wanted to stop having sex. So I just wanted to get it over and done with. So again, there's this opening up. There's increased agency for women now to hook up in ways that they weren't able to do in the past without being seen as sluts, and diminished quite significantly. So that's kind of okay now. So that's an opening up. But there's a closing down again, because there is that subordination of women's sexual fulfillment to men's again. So some things change and some things don't change. So that's Michael Kimmel. And then I wanted to move to England and a woman called Rosalind Gill. She's been interested in sexualisation of girls and women, and she's done a study on sexting as well. So again, we come back to this debate. It's the debate around sex work, it's the debate around pornography, it's the same debate really around sexualisation of women. Is it empowering for women? And she says there's two sides again. They look pretty much the same as the other two debates. And on one side of the debate, it's all about women's choice and power. And the other side of the debate is that it's a renewed form of sexual objectification. The question is, where is the power in this word empowerment? And Rosalind Gill says that word is not particularly a useful one. She says the terms pornification and sexualisation seem to pull us back into some sort of moral domain, which is why we're discussing it today, rather than one of politics or ethics. So they make us make judgments about explicitness and exposure rather than asking questions about equality or justice. She asked the question, might it not be more productive to talk about sexism rather than sexualisation? And she goes on to say that different people are sexualised in different ways and with different meanings. Sexualisation does not operate outside of processes of gendering, racialisation and classing, and it works within a visual economy that remains profoundly ableist, ageist and heteronormative. So she asks, so what does she mean by this when she's saying all of this? And she asks the question that if we imagine a girl being sexualised, who are we imagining? And she reckons that we're usually imagining a 13-year-old white girl. That's the point. And she says the typical 13-year-old girl is repeatedly mobilised in these debates about the sexualisation of girls. What if we changed her gender and thought about a 13-year-old boy? Or what if we changed her ethnicity and thought about a 13-year-old black girl? Or if we thought of her as a lesbian or as a girl living with a disability? Immediately this would open up entirely new ways of thinking. Sexual experiences might not be framed so strongly in terms of risk and danger. And so that's an interesting thought, that who is it that we're imagining when we're thinking about the sexualisation of girls, and we could extend that to women as well. She was part of a study in London looking at sexting, and the researchers found that the boys in the school got cultural capital, if I use that language, by collecting revealing pictures of their female classmates. So there was something in it for the boys. Their status was increased. And the male students who didn't participate in this, for ethical reasons or for what other reasons, were ridiculed as being gay, as if that's a bad thing. And she said there was a circulation of really sexist images, racist images, such as cartoonised images of black young men, so-called daggering white women as well. She says, do these practices reflect what's going on in the school, or are they projections of adult concerns about our own sexuality? Adolescents do not have the monopoly on unsafe, non-consensual, painful or unsatisfying sex, she says. I'm interested in a general tendency to project concerns about sex onto the young, which often seems to involve a complex displacement of our own unresolved issues around sexuality onto girls. When it comes to sexualisation, which has been integral really to ideas about freedom, especially for women, certainly since the sexual liberation movement in the 1970s. It often seems that young women are normatively demanded, so it becomes compulsory for women to perform confident, knowing heterosexiness. So is that about, if it's compulsory, is that about freedom? If it's kind of demanded? The new norm, Rosalind Gill says, but it's actually the entrenchment of old forms of sexism. It's demanding something from women that's not being demanded, and a particular demographic of women as well. So she says that sexism today is intricately linked with those discourses of empowerment. So we run the risk of saying that we're taking away women's agency if we decry the sexualisation of women, but we really should be thinking about sexism instead. Instead of been talking about empowerment and thinking about ways in which young people are either empowered or disempowered by our culture, which is heavily sexualised now, she says, it seems to me that the bigger and more urgent task is the shared one to create a culture in which young women and men can have sexual experiences that are safe, consensual, pleasurable and free from shame, which reminds me very much of what Gail Rubin was writing back in 1984 when she was saying it shouldn't be about the sexual act, it should be about the relationship between the people, and that should be about freedom from coercion. Just to sum up, panics over women's sexuality are not new. When the bicycle, if you can think of a time when there was a time before bicycles, when bicycles were first invented and women wanted to ride on them, there was a panic about them, that they would get too sexually excited by riding this bike. So believe it or not, panics about women and sex are not new. And think about that, how many panics we have over men and sex. Can you think of any? I can think of scandals, not so much panics though. Panics and scandals are a means of redrawing moral boundaries around sex and sexuality. So we might want to have them in the same place as they were before. We also might want to shift them out. And so as I've revisited Gail Rubin's paper today and had a look at that and thought about now, I think we've redrawn lots of moral boundaries, but there are still some there when I think about those boys in England saying that if other boys don't engage in this collection of naked girl pictures, then they're gay, then that's a closing down. That suggests that some things have not changed at all. Contemporary panics, as I said, are really focused around children and sexualisation and pornification, and that's because of new technology. So it's not as if children in the past weren't interested in sex, because they were. However, the availability and freedom to access it has changed quite significantly because of technology. The redefinition of the norms, so this normalisation. We do live in an age when pornography is normal. It really is, compared to years ago when you'd have to go buy something from your newsagent, brown paper bag. So that's all kind of completely disappeared. That's quite normalised now. But there's also this redrawing or reaffirming of boundaries around heteronormativity, gender, class and race, which all need to be thought of together. So if we think about, girls who are hot and girls who are slutty, that has as much to do with class and race as it does with gender as well. So we keep on redrawing that same boundary around that.
And that's it from me for this semester. Thanks very much for listening and for your attendance, and good luck with your final assignment.